Today I'm announcing a surge of federal law enforcement into American communities plagued by violent crime.
A showdown over federal law enforcement agents on the streets of America as Election Day gets closer.
I'm not a good loser. I don't like to lose.
And growing uncertainty over the post-election scenario if Trump loses. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. With less than 100 days before the November elections, Americans are facing a fateful decision. Who will lead their country out of the pandemic, and will each ballot count? As the coronavirus continues to rip through the country with over 4 million infections and a daily death toll exceeding 1,000, President Trump canceled the Republican National Convention set to be held in August in Florida, which saw a dramatic upsurge of coronavirus infections with a 34% increase of cases among children. And for the first time in months, unemployment claims are rising again, with millions of Americans receiving their last $600 federal unemployment check. Meanwhile, the state of Oregon saw violent clashes between protesters and police after Trump's decision to deploy unidentified federal agents on the streets of the capital, Portland, despite strong opposition from the governor, Kate Brown, who accused the president of invading Portland in, quote, a blatant abuse of power. The Trump administration said it will continue to deploy federal law enforcement agents to protect the federal courthouse and other public property, pledging to defeat, quote, violent anarchists. The president, who continues to trail Joe Biden in the polls, is seizing on his law and order campaign message by targeting cities with Democratic governors in what his critics say is an attempt to revive his lagging poll numbers and re-energize his base.
Extreme politicians have joined this anti-police crusade and relentlessly vilified our law enforcement heroes. To look at it from any standpoint, the effort to shut down policing in their own communities has led to a shocking explosion of shootings, killings, murders, and heinous crimes of violence. This bloodshed must end. This bloodshed will end.
As more federal agents are dispatched to Portland, and with protests against police violence rising in other cities, mayors of several major U.S. cities, including Chicago and Washington, D.C., have signed a letter calling on Congress to block President Trump from deploying federal agents without the consent of local authorities. Tear-gassed last week, the mayor of Portland also signed the letter and called the deployment of federal officers to his city, quote, an unconstitutional occupation. Attorney General William Barr, meanwhile, defended Trump's actions, telling the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee that the president has not inappropriately intervened in Portland.
What unfolds nightly around the courthouse cannot reasonably be called protest. It is, by any objective measure, an assault on the government of the United States.
With Trump threatening to send federal agents to Chicago, Philadelphia and Baltimore over the strong objections of local officials, the state attorney of Baltimore, the capital of the Republican-led state of Maryland, Marilyn Mosby, has sent a warning to President Trump to stay out of her city, and she joins me now. Attorney Mosby, you wrote this a few days ago. You said if President Trump sends militarized federal agents to Baltimore City to attack our citizens by making illegal arrests, kidnapping people, assaulting them, or committing any other crime, they will be prosecuted by my office. What exactly did you mean? Who will be prosecuted?
So what I mean by this is what we're experiencing in Portland and in Seattle is not only disturbing, but it's un-American. The world is witnessing in real time peaceful protesters that are not committing acts of violence, that are being assaulted, detained, and snatched away to undisclosed locations by men in military uniforms with generic police patches jumping out of unmarked vehicles. And what we're essentially saying is that at the end of the day, they are violating the federal agents in Portland appear to be going beyond the authority to protect federal property, and they will be held accountable. They're not only at this point going beyond their scope of authority and policing in violation of the 10th Amendment, which is states' rights, right? But they're violating the First Amendment right to peaceful protest, arresting people without probable cause in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And I'm saying that I'm going to use my authority to apply one standard of justice. And whether you're a federal agent or whether you're a police officer, or at this point, we don't even know if these are federal agents based upon Chad Wolf, who can designate these individuals. It might be right-wing extremists. But if you break the law in the city of Baltimore, you will be held accountable.
You say they will be held accountable, but the federal agents are acting under specific orders. If not from the president, from the attorney general, from the Department of Homeland Security, who will you be taking on exactly?
So what I've been very clear about is that, the scope of their authority extends to the protection of federal buildings. And, at this point, what we've seen, unfortunately, is that these individuals, these vigilante sort of exercises of judgment have been to assault peaceful protesters, to snatch peaceful protesters to undisclosed locations, to kidnap peaceful protesters, and to arrest them illegally. And if they continue that type of vigilante activism in the city of Baltimore, I have the scope and the authority of the 10th Amendment to prosecute them on a state level, and I intend to do so.
But realistically, what are you able to do now to stop this from happening in different cities, including Baltimore? The governor of Oregon said this.
This is a democracy, not a dictatorship. We cannot have secret police abducting people and putting them in unmarked vehicles. I cannot believe I have to say that to the President of the United States. I know that Oregonians are outraged. Americans should be appalled.
Does the Constitution clearly restrict the powers of the president, or is this subject to interpretation?
So it absolutely restricts the powers of the president. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution leaves the so-called police power in the hands of state and local officials. It is one that powers are not delegated to the United States of America, but is instead reserved to the respective states. And what I'm saying is that in those instances where I don't have the power to control the federal government in sending in these forces, but if these forces, these militarized, secretive police violate the laws, I have the Constitution, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, to allow me to prosecute them the same way I would anyone else, regardless of race, sex, religion, or occupation.
State Attorney Mosby, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
In the chaotic lead up to the election and with the recent surge in coronavirus cases, the tens of millions of Americans who have traditionally gone to polling booths to cast their ballots are reconsidering how they will vote in November. More and more states are turning to a vote-by-mail option as a safe alternative during the public health crisis. While 65% of Americans support the move, President Trump has publicly cast doubt on the security of mail-in ballots at least 50 times this year, claiming it could lead to the most corrupt election in the nation's history, while presenting no evidence of the potential for widespread fraud. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, says this issue is becoming increasingly politicized. The president is going to try to indirectly steal the election by arguing that mail-in ballots don't work. They're not real, they're not fair. So is President Trump trying to delegitimize mail-in voting ahead of the November 3rd election to pave the way for a challenge in case of an unfavorable outcome? And does mail-in voting lead to massive fraud, as the president claims? Joining me now is Kris, who served as Secretary of State for Kansas from 2011 to 2019. He was also the chair of the Kansas Republican Party and is currently running for the state's Republican Senate seat. Secretary Kobach, you co-chaired President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission with Vice President Mike Pence. It was established in 2017 to look into the almost 3 million votes that President Trump claimed he would have won in the 2016 popular vote if it wasn't for voter fraud. You couldn't prove a single case, though, and the president soon had to dissolve the commission. Doesn't that tell us all we need to know about the claims of voter fraud that the president and some of his Republican allies, including yourself, are repeating again in 2020?
Actually, that's not correct. The Voter Fraud Commission was dissolved because more than any commission in U.S. history, any presidential advisory commission, It was beset by more than a dozen lawsuits, 13 lawsuits to be exact, brought by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and other organizations of the left who did not want the commission to do its work. So they basically tied up the commission with depositions and legal action, so that the entire staff of the commission was too busy working on the legal activity as opposed to the actual mission of the commission.
But Secretary Kobach, the reality is some of the Democrats serving with you on that commission, in fact, also sued the commission because it withheld information material from them.
One did. And the other statement you made that's incorrect, not saying that you're intentionally saying it wrong, but there's been some misreporting. One of the first things the commission produced was approximately 2,000 convictions, not accusations, convictions of voter fraud since approximately 2001. Another figure that the commission also produced, I believe in its second meeting, was that in the 2016 election, looking at 21 states alone, approximately 8,400 people double voted, meaning they voted in 2 of those 21 states. And if you had extrapolated that to the entire 50 states, which we did not have time to do, but would have done had the commission continued, the number would have certainly been in the hundreds of thousands, because it increases exponentially when you add more states to the mix. So
hold on, Secretary Kobach, because you said that one of the Democrats on the commission sued you. And in fact, that Democrat, the Secretary of State of Maine, said that you were not able to present any compelling evidence. In fact, there were no indictments or prosecutions. You also mentioned the 8,400 instances of double voting across 20 states.
There's a prosecution, an indictment, and then conviction. And those 22,000 cases were convictions. So I don't know what he said, but he obviously was one of the individuals who was, repeating the left's talking points that voter fraud doesn't exist. When you have 2,000 convictions, voter fraud does exist. As Secretary of State of Kansas, I personally prosecuted more than a dozen cases of voter fraud, most of which were double voting. That is the most
more than a dozen cases, though, out of how many millions of voters? But you mentioned, let me take you on one of the points that you made. You mentioned 8,400 instances of double voting across 20 states. But we're talking about 3 million votes, not a few thousand. You say there were 24 million extra ballots that were sent out, which presented a huge opportunity for fraud. But you were just conjecturing. I mean, look at the facts, Secretary Kobach. Over the past 14 years, there have been only 31 credible incidents of impersonation fraud, according to the Brennan Center for Justice.
The Brennan Center for Justice is a left-wing institute that I'm constantly seeing. They try to indict every time there's an instance of voter fraud. They try to claim it doesn't exist. And the 8,400 cases were individuals who double voted in those states. And then you mentioned the 24 million. The 24 million statistic comes from the Pew Center for the States, which is not a conservative group. That is a neutral group. I think most people would say it's correct. That 24 million figure is the number of inaccurate names on the voter rolls among all 50 states combined. Inaccurate consists of 4 different categories: people who've moved away to a different state, people who are deceased, people who are not U.S. citizens, and people who are double registered, perhaps under the maiden name and the married name. And the reason that 24 million is such an important number is if we were to adopt universal vote by mail, where everybody on the voter rolls gets a ballot automatically without asking for it in the mailbox, then 24 million extra ballots would be sent out. That's undeniable. And then the question is, what happens? Do all of those people then say, oh gosh, I got an extra ballot, I'll call the county election officer and make sure that the ballot is disposed of? No, some would, but a large number would probably send in the extra ballots. And so that's why—
But what are you suggesting, though? Because a quarter of voters in the 2016 elections, that's 1 in 4, actually used mail-in ballots. Are you saying that a fourth of the votes were fraudulent in an election that President Trump and the Republicans actually won?
Please don't try to put words in my mouth. The 24 million is a cautionary number as to why we should never adopt a system of universal vote by mail. Most states, like Kansas, have elective vote by mail. You choose whether you want to vote in person or you can request a mail-in ballot earlier. And in Kansas, we have made vote by mail very secure. There's a signature match, so a ballot won't be sent to you unless the signature matches. There's also a virtual photo ID. You send in a photocopy of your photo ID. Other states don't have those security measures, and if they don't have those security measures, then vote by mail can be more vulnerable to fraud. Someone can intercept the mailbox, they can request your ballot for you, which happened in Kansas more than 50 times before we adopted those protective measures. So vote by mail can be very safe, but it can also be very prone to fraud, and in most states it is more prone to fraud.
But your claims that it is prone to fraud in most cases is just not supported by the facts. 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington actually use mail-in ballots as the primary form of voting. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, again, none has had any significant voter fraud scandals. Oregon, which has sent out more than 100 million ballots since 2000, in fact, has seen only 12 proven cases of fraud, which is just a tiny fraction. It's less than 1 in a million.
If you're getting your talking points from the Brennan Center for Justice, you're getting your talking points from a
But what are your facts? Where is the evidence to support your allegations of fraud?
No, let me tell you. Okay, so those 5 states have universal vote by mail, which is the type of system I say is very prone to fraud, and I hope we never have across the entire country. I can tell you that in Colorado, which adopted that system just a few election cycles ago, the Secretary of State of Colorado told me personally that in the election after they adopted it, just looking at the legislature, which is a relatively small number of people, one of the state legislators got 2 ballots in the mail, one under her married name and one under her maiden name. It is undeniable. It is an indisputable fact that there are 24 million extra names on our voter rolls, additional names. And in fact, 250 counties in the United States have more people on the voter rolls than exist in the county of voting age than are alive in the county. So this.
But you are running, Secretary Kobach, for a Senate seat actually in just a few days, and this is what you tweeted on July 24th. You said Tuesday, July 28th, 2020 is the deadline for voters to apply for advance ballots by mail for the primary. Kris needs all of his supporters energized and ready to vote for him. Why invite voters to apply for advance ballots by mail if, as you say, they lead to fraud?
No, it's interesting. I actually didn't send out that tweet or the text, whatever it may be.
That was tweeted from your account.
No, it's not. There's a huge number of outside groups that have been intervening in Kansas nationally on both the right and the left, trying to influence the outcome of this U.S. Senate race. It's one of only 4 open U.S. Senate seats in the entire country. And right now I'm one of the 2 candidates who's leading in the polls in a very, very tight race. And so, yeah, it's been an extraordinary amount of manipulation, people coming in and sending texts, tweets, ads. Over $4 million worth of ads have been put in this race against me. So, yeah, there are so many.
But what do you say to those critics of yours and of President Trump who say that this really is about suppressing votes and limiting the Democratic turnout? If turnout is higher than it was in 2016, they say Trump doesn't stand much of a chance. He himself said this year, if you have higher levels of voting, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
I disagree with that completely. I don't know what are you saying is about suppressing votes. I disagree with the statement that if you have a high number of votes, you can't elect Republicans. That's false.
But do you disagree with the president's statement in which he said that if you have high numbers of people voting, if you have higher levels of voting, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again?
I'm not aware exactly of that. This is the first time I've heard that statement. So I'd have to see the entirety of the statement. But no. I mean, I think you can have large numbers of people voting, and you can have an outcome either way. In fact, one of the things we saw in 2010, for example, which was a wave year for Republicans, was that there was a very high number of people voting in a non-presidential year, and it was Republicans coming out in massive numbers. Similarly, the converse happened in 2018. You saw a huge wave of Democrats coming out. This is very typical in the American political system, where in the election 2 years after a new president takes office, usually the other party sees a surge in voting for their party in Congress and in governor's races, and et cetera.
Former Secretary of State of Kansas, Kris Kobach, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, can states ensure that all votes will count and that voters can have faith in the results of the election? Joining me now is the Secretary of State of Maine, Matthew Dunlap, who will be overseeing the state's election in November. He was also one of 4 Democrats appointed to Trump's 2017 Voter Fraud Commission. After a legal battle, he reviewed commission documents and issued a scathing rebuke of the allegations of fraud in the 2016 election. Secretary Dunlap, you served on the same commission as Kris Kobach, a commission that was tasked with investigating claims of millions of fraudulent ballots in 2016, and you said there was no real evidence of it anywhere. You called it the most bizarre thing I've ever been part of. What does your experience and the commission's findings tell you about the assertions made by the president that the 2020 election will lead to massive fraud?
Well, knowing how elections are run in this country, certainly in the state of Maine, when the president of the United States was still the president-elect and said he would have won the popular vote as well as the electoral college, if not for 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast, all of us who work in elections just kind of shook our heads about that, because we certainly know how elections are run and how tabulations are certified. And there's absolutely nothing to back up the president's statement. But because the president had so emphatically said that, then informed the commission, we saw it as an opportunity to talk about how elections are really run. Now, I got kind of walled off in that process, and that's why I filed the lawsuit to find out what we were working on and who we were talking to, and really even what our schedule was, and was granted the preliminary injunction by a district court, and the president dissolved the commission right after that. The documents we did get showed a framed out report about voter fraud, even though we'd only had one substantive meeting and had never framed out a scope of work. So it was all sort of intellectually dishonest on its very premise. And what we saw in the documents that we reviewed afterwards only affirmed that.
Many people already suggest that we could be moving towards a likely contested election with all the mail-in voting, the delays, the logistical challenges that could create, unless it is a clear-cut landslide victory for either candidate. What do you say to that?
I think every vote counts, and I don't think it has to be a clear-cut landslide victory to make that determination. Of course, no two jurisdictions run their elections exactly the same way, so I can't speak with any expertise as to how all mail elections are conducted in Oregon, for example, as opposed to the straight runoff system that they have in Louisiana. Every state runs its own elections according to its own laws. What we've seen this year to date is that the elections have gone fairly smoothly, with the notable exceptions of Wisconsin and Georgia, where they had significant lines, a lot of court cases. The work that we do in advance of the election is try to prevent that and provide certainty to the voters. And I think if we do those things, we will have a very clear picture of who has won the 2020 presidential election and all the congressional races as well, not to mention the legislatures. So I think if we are able to maintain our composure and follow the law and use the systems that are provided to us in those laws, I don't think we should have anything disputed in the election in the aftermath.
But some are voicing serious concerns already about whether all sides will indeed accept the results. Your job as Secretary of State will be to certify the vote. The Republican Secretary of State of Washington, Kim Wyman, said this.
My biggest concern is for the fall election is election administrators' job is to convince the losers that they lost. And right now, as we sit here in June 2020, I guarantee you that half of the country cannot conceive that Republicans could win in November. The other half of the country cannot conceive that Democrats can win.
How concerned are you that voters on either side will not accept the results, or that the president might contest their legitimacy? He said he would have to wait and see.
Well, during the time of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, a reporter asked me the question in response to something that Secretary Kobach had said about, did he believe that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had won the popular vote? And Kobach said, we may never know. My response to that is that we know mathematically, because all 50 states certified their results. Now, certification is an affirmation of the results that are compiled at the local level. So it's not a mystery. And I think under that premise, under the rule of law, I think you'll see a peaceful transition of power if there is one, and an acceptance of the results if there is not.
Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Now, when it comes to the conduct of elections, the United States, the leader of the free world, may not be an exemplary model. Its electoral processes are cumbersome, its voting systems can vary from state to state, and are often out of date. In fact, many developing countries use newer technologies. And there is the practice of gerrymandering, the redrawing of electoral districts to favor a particular outcome, a national bipartisan electoral sport. To say the least, with only half of the electorate on average voting, American democracy may not be at its best. The past primaries have already exposed significant cracks in the electoral system. The technological challenges in Iowa, where the use of untested voting technologies and apps led to embarrassment and uncertainty, to the long voting lines in Georgia with equipment failures and missing absentee ballots. These mishaps are not new, but they have been overlooked as statistically insignificant in the past. But what may be overlooked in a normal electoral cycle is unlikely to be glossed over in one of the most consequential presidential elections. Legal experts are already discussing several scenarios which only a few months ago would have been pure science fiction, not any longer. Democrats are now fearful of various nightmares that Trump could use emergency powers to cancel the election altogether, which he could do if the US is at war, to calling in the military to, quote, oversee the voting, or simply refusing to concede, or worse, refusing to leave the White House. The Democratic challenger Joe Biden publicly raised that prospect about Trump, and Trump himself has refused to say that he will accept the voters' verdict. Some view his deployment of federal forces in some states and his continuing threats as dry runs for what is yet to come. But in short, anything can still happen between now and Election Day. At this time 4 years ago, Trump was trailing Hillary Clinton by the same margins he is trailing Joe Biden today. So will history repeat itself? It seldom does. That's all from me. Let us know what you think. Send us your thoughts and comments. But for now, from me and the team, thanks for watching.